Today, there are over 8 billion humans on Earth. We live in cities that glow at night like constellations. We build, explore, and dream as if we were always meant to survive. But if you could rewind time 10 million years, that confidence would vanish. The world was different then. The air was drier, the forests were shrinking, and our ancestors were hanging on by their fingertips. Whole lineages of apes were disappearing, forests turning to grass, lakes drying into dust. It was a planet full of dead ends, and somehow, through all of it, a handful of adaptable, curious, and social creatures managed to stay alive. They weren't human yet, not even close, but every choice they made, every risk they took, every storm they survived, became a thread in the story that led to us. We like to think survival is about power, but back then it was about timing, teamwork, and luck. It's strange to realize that the only reason you're hearing this right now is because a few million years ago, someone found water where no one else could. Someone shared food instead of fighting. Someone remembered the path out of the drought. That's how close we came to not existing. If you use these videos to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make them. So subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. I check the comments and it's wild to see. London at sunrise, Manila after midnight. A whole planet of survivors, all watching the story of how we almost never were. You know that feeling when you realize everything you depend on could disappear overnight? Imagine the air turning drier each year, the trees you climb dying one by one, and the fruit that once filled your hands turning to dust. That was life 10 million years ago, and it nearly ended the story of us before it even began. The Earth was changing in ways no creature could fully prepare for. The climate, once warm and steady, began to wobble like a candle flame caught in a draught. Rain stopped falling where it used to. Forests shrank and vanished, leaving behind endless patches of open grass. For the apes that ruled the treetops, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was a death sentence. Picture that world for a second. You are an ape in East Africa, swinging between branches that have become scarce and brittle. The once green canopy has broken apart into small, scattered islands of trees, surrounded by grasslands filled with predators. Every leap from one tree to another feels like a gamble. The forests are dying faster than your kind can adapt. And somewhere in that chaos, a few of your ancestors are faced with a decision that will change everything. Do they stay in the trees and wait for the forest to return? Or do they climb down into the grass where danger waits in every direction? Most stay, some don't. The ones that take that terrifying step onto the ground begin a journey that will eventually lead to us. The odds were against them from the start. 10 million years ago, dozens of ape species lived across Africa, Asia, and Europe. They were thriving, diverse, and well adapted to their world. Then the world shifted beneath them. Temperatures fell, rainfall patterns collapsed, and ancient forests turned to savannas. The apes that couldn't adapt went extinct one by one until only a handful of lineages survived. The path to humanity was not a grand march forward, but a desperate scramble along the edge of extinction. Every surviving branch of the family tree came from those who could think, experiment, and take risks. Maybe they learned to crack nuts open with stones. Maybe they learned to travel farther to find food. Maybe they simply learned to cooperate just a little better than their neighbors. Whatever the reason, they survived while others vanished. It's strange to think that the reason we exist today might come down to a few frightened apes willing to break their habits. Without them, there would be no humans, no cities, no stories. No one to look back and wonder how close we came to never existing at all. The late Miocene wasn't just a time of change. It was the moment the coin was tossed. On one side lay extinction, on the other a faint possibility that intelligence, curiosity, and persistence could win against chaos. Against all odds, the coin landed in our favor. That is the only reason you are here to hear this story. 10 million years ago, the Earth was a planet in transition. It wasn't the lush green paradise of the early Miocene, nor the frozen world that would come later. It was something in between, a place where everything was shifting at once. The air was a little cooler, the rains a little less predictable, and the balance between life and death had begun to tilt. Forests that had stretched for hundreds of miles started to thin out, replaced by wide patches of grassland dotted with dry shrubs. The rivers that had once flooded their banks every season began to shrink into narrow, twisting streams. It was the start of a new world, and most creatures weren't ready for it. Africa was the heart of the storm. The land was splitting apart as tectonic forces pulled at its crust, lifting mountains and creating vast rift valleys that changed rainfall patterns forever. Where rain once fell year-round, it now came in violent bursts, followed by months of brutal dryness. Lakes appeared and disappeared like mirages. Animals that depended on consistency began to vanish. Only the ones that could adjust, the ones that could live with uncertainty, survived. Eurasia wasn't spared either. Forests that had blanketed southern Europe were receding. Grass was spreading across the continents, and with it came a whole new caste of creatures. Hoofed mammals, early horses, antelopes, and elephants began to move south, while African species moved north. It was like a great biological exchange program. Species crossed continents, mingling and competing for the same shrinking resources. For apes, who had evolved to live in the safety of trees, this was a dangerous time. Food sources that had always been reliable became rare. Fruits ripened less often. Trees grew farther apart. Every new season brought a gamble. Do you stay where you are and risk starvation, or travel across open grass where predators watch from the tall, dry blades? Some apes tried to cling to their old ways, staying in the few forests that remained. Others took cautious steps into the open, using scattered trees as islands in a sea of grass. Those that survived learned to adapt to unpredictability itself. They became creatures that could live between two worlds, comfortable neither in forest nor in open plain, but skilled enough to move through both. This period, the late Miocene, forged the rules that would shape everything that came after. It wasn't just an age of change. It was an age that demanded creativity. The creatures that lived then were forced to experiment, to explore, to survive in ways their ancestors never needed to imagine. When you look at the world today, with humans building cities and machines that span continents, you're seeing the distant echo of what started in that unstable time. 10 million years ago, the Earth began to reward the bold and punish the static. That single truth would define the path to everything that followed. There was a time when apes ruled the forests. 10 million years ago, their world was filled with movement, color, and sound. Dozens of species swung through endless canopies that stretched from Africa to Europe and deep into Asia. They weren't rare or fragile then. They were everywhere. Big ones, small ones, long, armed leaf-eaters, fruit specialists with delicate jaws, slow climbers built like wrestlers, and graceful jumpers leaping from branch to branch. It was an age of plenty. The forests were full of food, fruit ripened year-round, and predators were easy to spot from high above the ground. Life was good. But good times never last forever. As the planet cooled, the forests began to break apart. Rain fell less often, trees stopped growing close together, and open grass started creeping between them. The The great green highways that had once connected ape families across continents fractured into isolated patches. For an animal that lived and fed among the trees, this was catastrophic. Imagine spending your entire life in a world of branches and shade, then one day looking out and realizing that the forest has turned into scattered islands, surrounded by danger. The trees that remain are too far apart to swing between, and the ground between them hides lions, crocodiles, and saber-toothed cats. Staying in the trees meant starving slowly. Climbing down meant risking death. That's the choice our distant cousins faced. Most apes couldn't make the adjustment. They were too specialized. Some depended on certain fruits that no longer grew. Others had body shapes built for one kind of movement that no longer worked in the patchy new forests. Their skills, perfect for a stable world, became useless in a changing one. And so, one by one, the forests emptied. Species that had thrived for millions of years vanished, leaving only fossils to tell their story. By the end of this collapse, most ape species were gone. The few that survived did so by accident or adaptation. They learned to eat tougher foods, to climb less and walk more, to travel farther to find what they needed. They started using intelligence, not instinct, to survive. It's strange to think that this collapse, this great extinction of the apes, was also the spark that began the human journey. The world that killed their comfort made our future possible. The apes that endured became innovators, risk-takers, and explorers of strange new environments. They didn't know it, but they were rewriting the rules of what it meant to be an ape. The forests they lost forced them to think differently, to plan, to cooperate, and to test the ground that had once terrified them. The boom had ended. The golden age of the apes was over. But from the wreckage of their decline, something entirely new was beginning. The path to humanity wasn't born in abundance. It was born in loss. The world began to dry out. It didn't happen all at once, but slowly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat fading over time. Rain that had once come every season began to fail. The great forests that had wrapped the continents in green began to retreat. Rivers shrank. Lakes turned to mudflats. The earth was tilting into a new age of drought and dust. Scientists call it the Great Drying, a period when the planet's climate flipped from stable and wet to unstable and arid. It was one of the most important turning points in the story of life. For millions of years, forests had been predictable machines of plenty. Now, they were breaking down into patchwork mosaics of woodland, grassland, and desert. In Africa, this shift was brutal. Monsoon winds that once carried heavy rains north from the Indian Ocean started to weaken. Storms became erratic, and when they came in violent bursts that washed away soil instead of feeding it. Seasons that had once followed a familiar rhythm turned chaotic. Some years brought floods, others near total drought. Animals that had depended on consistency found themselves in a world that could no longer be trusted. For the creatures that lived in the trees, this was disaster. The green corridors that connected forests were turning into dry plains where nothing grew tall enough to hide. Every migration meant crossing open space filled with predators. But some species didn't just suffer, they changed. They learned to make use of what little the new world offered. Grassland wasn't empty. It was filled with roots, seeds, and small prey. The animals that could switch diets survived. Those that couldn't vanished. Flexibility became the new superpower. Adaptability replaced specialization. Imagine standing on a ridge 10 million years ago, looking out over a land that can't decide what it wants to be. A cluster of trees on one side, a stretch of dry savanna on the other. In the distance, shimmering heat waves where a lake used to be, Life in this world wasn't about thriving anymore. It was about making it to the next season. Every creature was gambling on change. Those who learned to move with the rhythm of droughts and floods began to inherit the earth. And in this chaos, something strange was happening. Survival began to depend less on instinct and more on decision-making. The animals that could remember where water had been last year, that could plan, that could cooperate, were the ones that made it through the Great Drying. The world was forcing intelligence to evolve. The Great Drying didn't just shape the landscape. It shaped the minds that would one day build cities and study the stars. It turned the struggle for life into a test of creativity. From that test, the ancestors of humanity emerged, carrying with them the one trait that would define our species forever: the ability to adapt. The ground beneath Africa began to tear itself apart. Deep within the earth, ancient tectonic forces stirred, stretching and cracking the crust like drying clay. Over millions of years, these movements created what we now call the East African Rift. It was not one clean break, but a slow, violent rearrangement of land. The continent began to split, pulling valleys downward while raising mountains and plateaus around them. Volcanoes erupted where the crust thinned, spilling rivers of lava that cooled into new rock. It was as if the planet itself was playing chess, moving continents and reshaping the board where evolution would take place. The results were dramatic. As valleys sank, water rushed in, forming long, narrow lakes. But these lakes never stayed the same for long. Some filled until they overflowed. Others evaporated, leaving behind salt pans that glistened under the burning sun. The landscape was constantly in motion, never predictable. One generation might grow up beside a lush, freshwater lake full of fish. The next might live beside a poisonous salt flat that killed everything that drank from it. Populations of animals that had once been connected found themselves trapped on opposite sides of mountains, rifts, or dried lake beds. Over time, these isolated groups began to evolve differently, each adapting to its own new reality. Africa became a continent of experiments. In one valley, a group of apes learned to survive near lakes that appeared and vanished with the rains. In another, their cousins adapted to cooler mountain forests. Further north, others learned to forage in open woodland, where danger lurked in every shadow. Each pocket of life became a laboratory, testing new body shapes, new diets, new behaviors. Some of these experiments failed and vanished. Others worked, and their descendants would carry those traits forward into the future. This geological chaos didn't just separate species. It also connected events across deep time. The same tectonic forces that raised volcanoes also affected rainfall. Mountains blocked moist air, creating rain shadows that turned once fertile land into desert. Elsewhere, high plateaus captured just enough moisture to support green oases surrounded by dust. These tiny, stable zones became refuges, places where life could hold on while the world around it changed. Scientists think it was in one of these refuges that the ancestors of humans found their footing. The constant upheaval of the rift may have been the key to our evolution. The landscape forced populations to adapt quickly, to move, to think. It rewarded flexibility and punished complacency. Each shift of the ground wrote a new rule for survival. Every earthquake and every rising mountain gave birth to new possibilities. The East African Rift wasn't just shaping the land, it was shaping minds. It was teaching life that nothing stays the same, and that those who can adjust will outlast those who cannot. In that restless terrain, our story began to take its first fragile steps. The world 10 million years ago was not simple. It wasn't one endless forest or one open savanna. It was a mosaic, a patchwork of every kind of land stitched together by chaos. You could walk for a single day and pass through thick forest, dry woodland, swampy wetlands, and open grass flats before nightfall. Each zone had its own rules, its own food, its own dangers. For the animals living there, survival wasn't about mastering one environment anymore. It was about moving between them. Africa in this era was unpredictable. Rain came and went without pattern. Rivers changed course. Lakes filled and vanished. What was safe one year could become deadly the next. A drought could turn a green valley into a dust bowl. A storm could flood it days later and fill it with reeds and fish. Life had to learn to flow with the planet instead of fighting it. That meant flexibility became everything. For our distant ancestors, this new world demanded movement. You could no longer depend on a single food source or one kind of shelter. When the forest fruit ran out, you might have to wade into wetlands to dig for roots, or travel across open grass to find carcasses left by predators. Those who couldn't shift between worlds starved. Those who could became the future. Picture it from the view of one of those early apes. In the morning, you wake among trees, gathering figs and berries. By noon, the heat drives you toward the edge of the forest, where grasslands stretch to the horizon. You cross cautiously, eyes scanning for leopards or ancient hyenas. In the distance, you spot a river, lined with tall green reeds. There, fish shimmer in shallow pools, and crocodiles glide silently below the surface. To live here, you have to know how to read the land, how to sense danger, and how to remember where the safest paths lie. Over generations, this constant shifting changed everything. Limbs grew stronger for climbing and walking. Eyes became sharper for spotting both fruit and predators. Minds learned to plan ahead, to remember where the nearest water lay, or when a certain tree would bear fruit. These were small mental leaps at first, but they were steps towards something extraordinary. The Mosaic world was like a teacher, giving endless lessons in flexibility and awareness. It forced life to become inventive. Those who learned to cross boundaries between forest and field, between land and water, became the ones that lasted. Every decision mattered. Every move was a risk. The land itself was shaping intelligence one step at a time. This patchwork earth was more than a backdrop. It was a crucible, blending danger and opportunity in equal measure. Out of that mixture came creatures that would learn not just to survive the shifting world, but to understand it. In that understanding lay the first spark of what would someday become human thought. Hunger has always been one of evolution's greatest teachers. 10 million years ago, food was no longer easy to find. The fruit that once grew in abundance became seasonal and scattered. The forests that had fed generations were shrinking, and what remained couldn't feed everyone. For our distant ancestors, every meal became a puzzle, and every mouthful was earned through pain, patience, and invention. When the world dried out, the menu changed. Soft fruits gave way to hard, shelled nuts, tough roots, and fibrous stems. These were the fallback foods, the things you ate when everything else ran out. They were the difference between life and starvation. But nature never makes survival easy. These new foods were locked behind barriers of armor and bitterness. Tubers hid underground, coated with dirt and toxins. Nuts demanded crushing force to open. Stems resisted with stringy fibers that wore down teeth. Eating became an act of endurance. Those who could adapt, who could figure out how to unlock these resources, gained a powerful advantage. You can almost picture it. An ancient ape crouches beside a dry riverbed, scraping at the soil with a broken stick. After minutes of digging, it pulls out a starchy root. It's tough and bitter, barely edible, but it keeps hunger away. Another group sits beneath a tree, pounding hard nuts between stones until they crack. The sound echoes through the air like primitive music, each strike a note in the symphony of survival. Slowly, these behaviors became habits, and habits became instincts. Teeth evolved thicker enamel to withstand the grinding of rough foods. Jaws grew stronger, muscles more powerful. But this wasn't just a physical change, it was a mental one. Every meal became a test of creativity. To eat was to solve a problem. That simple act of cracking, scraping, or soaking required thought. It demanded memory, timing, and experimentation. If one technique failed, another had to be tried. Over time, that curiosity fed the mind as much as the body. Ingenuity began at the mouth. The daily battle against tough food taught problem, solving long before stone tools were invented. Those who learned faster, who copied smarter techniques from others, were the ones who thrived. Cooperation became part of the process too. Sharing discoveries meant more mouths fed and more ideas spread. What started as a simple fight against hunger became the foundation for culture. The taste of survival was bitter, but it forced intelligence to grow. When food fought back, it shaped the teeth that would later smile, the hands that would build, and the brains that would imagine. Every crunch of a nut, every chew of a root, was part of an ancient lesson. The world was teaching us resilience through our hunger. In those long, hungry seasons, nature wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. It was forging the first sparks of invention, one bite at a time. The tall grass hid everything. From a distance, it looked calm, golden waves moving gently in the wind. But inside, it was a world of ambushes. Every rustle could mean death. 10 million years ago, the open plains of Africa were ruled by predators that make even modern lions seem small. Saber-toothed cats, called machairodonts, stalked the edges of woodlands. They were built for power, not speed, with jaws that could crush through bone. Crocodiles the size of small cars lurked in shrinking rivers, waiting for the thirsty and the careless. Packs of ancient hyenas roamed in groups, scavengers and hunters at once, while raptors circled above, searching for movement in the grass. It was a time when being prey meant constant awareness. For our ancestors, the forest had once been a shield. High branches offered safety, vision, and distance from danger. But as the forests thinned and the open plains spread, the rules changed. There was nowhere to hide. Every step into the grass was a risk. Those who didn't learn to see danger coming didn't live long enough to pass on their genes. Fear became a form of intelligence. Survival wasn't just about running faster, it was about thinking faster. You had to read every sound, every shift of wind, every shadow that didn't move quite right. Those who learned to recognize the patterns of predators gained seconds of warning, and in a world of claws and teeth, seconds meant survival. Soon, survival became a team effort. Small groups of apes began to travel together across the plains, keeping watch for one another. A single pair of eyes could be fooled, a dozen could not. Some watched from trees, while others foraged on the ground. When danger appeared, alarm calls echoed through the group, sharp cries that carried across the wind. Over generations, these calls became more specific, a language of survival before true speech existed. Each warning sound carried meaning, telling others what kind of threat was near and where to run. Living in groups changed everything. It required trust, coordination, and empathy. You couldn't afford selfishness when one mistake could doom everyone. Sharing food and responsibilities became vital. Some stood guard, while others ate. Some carried young, while others searched for safety. Slowly, these patterns formed the foundation of social life. Cooperation wasn't a choice. It was the only strategy that worked. The predators in the tall grass were ruthless, but they also became teachers. They taught us how to watch, how to warn, how to care. They shaped the first sparks of community and communication. Every hunt, every chase, every narrow escape rewired the brain toward awareness. The world outside was dangerous, but it was also sharpening us, turning fear into foresight, reaction into strategy. Out there in the golden grass, under a burning Miocene sun, the long battle between hunter and hunted was creating something new, a creature that could think its way out of extinction. There were times when our ancestors came dangerously close to vanishing, not because of one single disaster, but because the world kept dividing them into smaller and smaller groups. The forests and lakes that once connected their habitats had splintered apart. Populations that had once numbered in the thousands were now separated by miles of dry grass or impassable cliffs. Each little pocket of life became an island, and islands are fragile. A drought, a disease, even a single predator attack could erase an entire group in a matter of weeks. Imagine a family of 20 apes living near a shrinking river. They know every tree, every watering hole, every hidden path through the reeds. Then one year, the rains fail completely. The riverbed cracks and turns to dust. Food runs out. The group is forced to travel across open ground to find a new home. Half of them don't survive the journey. A few make it to the next patch of trees, and there they start again, but now their world is smaller, their choices are fewer. Every birth and every death suddenly matters. That is what it means to live on the edge of disappearance. When populations are this small, strange things happen to the flow of genes. In a big, healthy population, random events don't matter much. If one family dies, others carry the same genes forward. But when there are only a few families left, chance becomes a powerful force. A flood, a fire, a bad season could wipe out traits that once helped survival, or allow harmful ones to spread unchecked. It's called genetic drift, and it turns evolution into a lottery. Some generations win, others don't. There was another problem too, one even more personal. With so few individuals around, inbreeding became almost impossible to avoid. Children were often born from closely related parents, and that meant a higher risk of inherited defects, weak immune systems, lower fertility, vulnerability to disease. In a world already stacked against survival, these invisible enemies made things even harder, and yet, somehow, enough of them survived to keep the story going. How? Because life adapts even to isolation. Small groups learn to travel farther, to join with others when they could, to share mates between bands. Over time, this movement helped mix their genes again, keeping extinction just out of reach. But the danger never fully disappeared. Every generation lived under the shadow of the math. Too few individuals meant too little margin for error. It's possible that more than once, the entire line of human ancestors was reduced to just a few hundred. That's how close we came to never existing. Small numbers make a species fragile, but they also make it resilient in a strange way. When survival depends on every member, cooperation becomes instinct. Each life matters. Every choice echoes through generations. Out of that fragile beginning grew a species that would one day dominate the planet, but only because it first learned what it meant to almost disappear. A brain is expensive. Every thought, every spark of awareness, every decision burns energy. For our ancestors living 10 million years ago, that cost was enormous. Food was scarce, water unreliable, and every calorie counted. Yet somehow, evolution began pouring more and more energy into their heads. The question is why? Why would nature invest in a bigger brain when survival already pushed every system to its limit? The answer lies in the chaos of their world. When the climate stopped being predictable, instinct wasn't enough anymore. Animals that could rely only on routine and reflex were doomed. The ones that could improvise, who could remember, plan, and experiment, had a small but crucial edge. That tiny edge, repeated over thousands of generations, changed everything. Think of the brain as a high-cost tool. For most creatures, the cost outweighs the benefits. Brains need constant fuel, and in a world of hunger, big brains are a luxury. But in unstable environments, they become essential. When the same place could be wet one year and bone dry the next, only flexibility could guarantee survival. For early apes, this meant remembering where fruiting trees were, learning which roots stayed edible in drought, or recognizing the signs of approaching rain. Each small act of problem-solving saved lives, and evolution rewarded it. But this growth came at a price. Bigger brains needed more energy, which meant longer foraging times, more cooperation, and smarter strategies to get food. They had to become energy economists, balancing the calories spent searching for food against the calories earned from eating it. Every decision mattered. Over time, this created a feedback loop. Smarter individuals found better ways to survive, which allowed their larger brains to sustain themselves, which in turn led to even more problem-solving. Intelligence began to feed on itself. It wasn't human yet, but the foundation was there. You can almost imagine an ancient ancestor sitting under a dying tree, staring at a hard nut or an unreachable branch, thinking of a new way to solve an old problem. That moment of hesitation, that pause before action, was the difference between instinct and invention. It was the birth of something new. As brains grew more complex, social life followed. Cooperation required memory and empathy. Watching others and learning from them demanded attention and imitation. These small sparks of awareness formed the beginnings of culture. The group could now store information across generations, not in DNA but in memory. Knowledge became the new survival tool, and in a strange way, the harshness of the environment made it all possible. The world forced our ancestors to think their way out of trouble. Every unpredictable season was a test. Every dry year was a lesson. The apes who passed those tests became the ones who would shape the future. Brains were costly, yes, but they were also powerful. And in a world that punished routine and rewarded imagination, that investment began to pay off. Long before anyone shaped a stone into a knife or a spear, our ancestors were already using their hands to change the world. 10 million years ago, the hand was not just a limb, it was a laboratory. Every tree branch, every piece of bark, every broken stick was an experiment waiting to happen. The earliest apes were not toolmakers in the modern sense, but they were already learning what their fingers could do. Grasping, probing, pounding. These were not just random actions. They were the start of a revolution. The hand gave access to ideas the mind had not yet learned to name. Picture an ancient ape crouched by a riverbank. It watches a shellfish clamped tight, impossible to bite open. A nearby stone catches the eye. It lifts it, drops it, and hears the satisfying crack of success. That single motion, repeated thousands of times across generations, began teaching the brain what it meant to manipulate the world instead of merely surviving in it. The hand and the brain were evolving together, partners in an invisible dance that would one day define humanity. Our ancestors discovered that their hands were not just for climbing or feeding. They were tools for thinking. Every new motion carved a deeper connection between muscle and memory. To grip, twist, and strike required focus, It required patience and timing. These were the same mental skills that would later allow us to plan hunts, craft language, and build fire. The difference between an ape that merely survives and one that invents begins at the fingertips. Over time, small changes in anatomy made those experiments easier. Thumbs became stronger, fingers more flexible, wrists more stable. These tiny adjustments didn't happen overnight. They were the result of countless generations learning that using the environment could mean the difference between life and death. A stick could dig up roots. A stone could break open bones for the rich marrow inside. A handful of leaves could be shaped into a scoop for gathering water. None of this required conscious invention, just the quiet persistence of trial and error. The more they used their hands, the more their brains adapted to using them better. The cycle never stopped. Each discovery created new possibilities, and each new possibility required greater control and awareness. The connection between hand and brain became a feedback loop of creativity. What began as simple curiosity grew into the foundation of technology. The hand became the first teacher. It taught that the world could be changed with touch, that problems could be solved through motion, that nature itself could be shaped into something useful. Every grasp was a question, every strike was an answer. Through those small acts of contact and curiosity, our ancestors learned the most powerful lesson evolution could offer. To control the hand was to control the future. In the ancient landscapes of Africa, water was everything. It was life, memory, and destiny. 10 million years ago, lakes and rivers appeared and vanished like ghosts. A valley that glittered blue one season could turn to cracked white earth the next. Springs that had flowed for generations could dry up without warning. For our ancestors, survival meant learning the rhythm of these changes. Water wasn't just something to find, it was something to remember. Imagine a small band of early apes walking under the heat of a relentless sun. The air shimmers with dust. The grass is dry and brittle. They know the nearest lake is gone. They have been here before. Somewhere beyond the ridge there might be a spring that still flows, hidden beneath a patch of reeds. The only way to reach it is to remember the path taken years earlier when the world was wetter. The adults lead, following invisible landmarks, trusting memories passed down through generations. Finding water became an act of intelligence as much as instinct. This constant cycle of drought and renewal forced our ancestors to develop powerful spatial awareness. They began to build mental maps of the land, tracing the patterns of rivers, the timing of rainfall, the shadows of mountains where moisture lasted longest. The ability to predict where water would appear became a survival skill more valuable than strength or speed. Over thousands of generations, this shaped behavior, movement, and even thought. Those who could remember survived. Those who forgot did not. The search for water was also the birth of navigation. Groups learned to travel farther than ever before, sometimes walking for days between scattered lakes. This meant recognizing landmarks, reading the stars, and following the flight of birds or the paths of animals that also needed to drink. Memory became mobility. The brain began to store not just what was seen, but when and where it was seen. The landscape turned into a living calendar. In this unpredictable world, water shaped more than just migration. It shaped social life. Groups had to cooperate, sharing routes and warnings. Conflict over the last remaining springs could be deadly, but so could isolation. Bands that learned to communicate and coordinate stood a better chance. Knowledge about water sources was passed between generations, becoming an early form of shared wisdom, a kind of oral geography long before words existed. This deep connection to water carved itself into our evolution. Even today, humans are drawn to it. Our cities rise near coasts and rivers. Our earliest myths begin with floods and fountains. The memory of water runs through our DNA like a quiet echo from the past. For our ancestors, every drop was sacred. Every journey to find it was a lesson in endurance, cooperation, and memory. They didn't just follow the flow of rivers. They followed the flow of time itself, learning that life on this planet has always depended on knowing where the water is and never forgetting how to find it. Before fire became a tool, it was a mystery. 10 million years ago, lightning would split the sky and strike the dry grasslands, igniting walls of flame that roared across the horizon. To the creatures that lived there, fire was both terrifying and fascinating. It destroyed everything in its path, but when the smoke cleared, it left behind a new kind of world. Fresh green shoots sprang up where the ashes settled. Animals returned to feed on the tender regrowth. For our ancestors, this pattern didn't go unnoticed. They began to follow the burn scars. It was dangerous, but it was also opportunity. Fire was teaching them, long before they learned to control it. Imagine the scene. A storm breaks over a parched savanna. Thunder rolls, and lightning strikes the dry grass. Flames spread fast, carried by the wind, devouring everything in sight. For hours, the air glows red and gold, then silence. The fire moves on, leaving behind blackened earth. Days later, new life appears. The smell of rain mixes with the scent of ash. Herds of animals return to graze on the soft shoots that rise from the burned soil, and following them, cautiously, come the apes. They pick through the charred remains, searching for insects, nuts, and roots roasted by the heat. They learn that where fire passes, food follows. The landscape after a burn is dangerous, but full of reward. Burnt logs are still warm, hiding grubs inside. Cracked branches reveal seeds that would have been too hard to eat before. Even the behavior of prey animals becomes more predictable after fires. In the ashes, early ancestors found a new rhythm of survival. They didn't make the fire, but they began to understand its patterns. To follow fire was to follow life. This was the first step toward one of humanity's greatest powers. But in these early ages, fire remained a thing of fear. No one dared approach it too closely. The heat could kill, and the smoke could choke. The memory of burned land carried both promise and warning. Still, the lesson was sinking in. Fire reshaped the land faster than any other force. It cleared old growth and made space for new. It concentrated life in fresh green patches that appeared like islands of plenty. Knowing when and where the fires would come became a kind of seasonal wisdom. Some groups learned to stay near lightning-prone areas, timing their movements to match nature's own cycle of destruction and renewal. Without realizing it, they were beginning to map the behavior of the sky itself. Fire was not yet theirs to hold, but it had already entered their minds. It was the first glimpse of control over nature, the first awareness that chaos could bring order. In the distance, beyond the fear, our ancestors saw the flicker of something that would one day change everything. They didn't know it yet, but the spark that would define humanity was already glowing on the horizon. In a world full of predators, no one survives alone. 10 million years ago, the open plains of Africa were as dangerous as they were beautiful. Every sound carried a warning. The rustle of grass could mean a stalking cat. The ripple of water might hide a crocodile. For our ancestors, safety depended on awareness, but no single individual could watch everything. That is when cooperation became more than a habit. It became a technology, a living tool that multiplied the power of each member in the group. Imagine a small band of apes moving through a clearing. Some gather food, while others climb trees to scan the horizon. One spots movement and gives a sharp call. Instantly, the group freezes. Seconds later, a saber-toothed cat emerges from the grass. The warning saves them all. This act might seem simple, but it is revolutionary. Information has become a shared resource. Each eye and ear now serves the whole. The group is thinking together. Over time, these moments turned into instinct. Watch duty became routine. Mothers carried young while others stood guard. Older members taught the young to recognize danger calls and subtle gestures. This was the birth of collective intelligence, the point where survival depended less on individual strength and more on social coordination. Cooperation was not just kindness, it was strategy. When predators could strike at any moment, sharing knowledge and responsibility became the best defense. Even small tasks gained power when done together. One ape could not fight off a leopard, but 10 could drive it away with noise and thrown branches. One could not always find food, but many could remember where fruit trees grew and share that information. This network of awareness created stability in a chaotic world. It also changed the way the brain worked. To cooperate required empathy, patience, and memory. You had to understand what others were doing and why. That mental skill was rare in nature. It demanded imagination, the ability to picture another's perspective. Slowly, this rewired the mind toward connection. Language would not exist for millions of years, but the foundation of it was forming here in these simple acts of teamwork. Cooperation even transformed parenting. Instead of mothers raising their young alone, entire groups began to share childcare. If one mother was injured or searching for food, another could carry her infant. This collective care improved survival rates and freed adults to focus on gathering and defense. Over generations, it created stronger bonds and more stable families. Trust became the glue that held everything together. The more complex the world grew, the more cooperation paid off. It became the original human technology, the invisible invention that made every other invention possible. Eyes and ears turned into early warning systems. Voices and gestures became tools of command. And through it all, our ancestors learned a simple truth that still defines us today. Alone we are fragile, but together we are unstoppable. Movement was everything. 10 million years ago, the world was shifting beneath our ancestors' feet. Forests came and went. Rivers carved new paths. Mountains rose slowly like sleeping giants waking from dreams. The apes that stayed too long in one place often vanished with the land that fed them. The ones that moved survived, but movement was a gamble. Every step towards safety could lead to disaster. Every journey carried the risk of running out of water, food, or luck. The challenge was knowing when to stay and when to go. Imagine standing on the edge of a dried lake bed. Behind you, the forest that once fed your family is silent. Ahead, heat waves shimmer over the plains. You don't know what lies beyond, only that staying means starvation. The decision to move is not made lightly. The old and the young might not survive the journey. Yet, somehow, instincts push you forward. You follow the faint scent of moisture on the wind, hoping it leads to a spring or a patch of green. That single act of courage, repeated across generations, is what kept our lineage alive. As the planet's climate swung between wet and dry cycles, entire populations shifted their ranges. Some moved along rivers that served as corridors of life, narrow paths linking scattered oases. Others crossed mountains and valleys, expanding into new territories where no ape had gone before. Every migration rewrote the story of evolution. When groups became isolated, they began to change. Each new environment demanded different skills, diets, and behaviors. Some lineages adapted and flourished. Others hit dead ends. Fossils tell the story of these lost branches, species that took the wrong path or arrived just a little too late. For every survivor, there were dozens that didn't make it. Movement was never just about travel. It was about timing, awareness, and risk. Those who learned to read the land, to sense when the rains were failing or when new plants were blooming elsewhere, gained an advantage. Memory became the map. Generations learned the roots of their ancestors, passing down knowledge of safe trails and hidden springs. This was how culture began, not with words, but with footsteps. The pattern of migration shaped bodies too. Longer legs, stronger endurance, better balance. Evolution rewarded those built for travel. But the most important change happened in the mind. To move meant to imagine something better beyond the horizon. It meant trusting that what you could not see was worth the danger of leaving what you knew. That spark of hope, that instinct to seek more, would one day lead our species out of Africa and across the planet. The gamble of movement was the greatest risk our ancestors ever took, and it paid off. Every step they took into the unknown became a foundation stone for the human story. Movement wasn't just survival, it was destiny. Before anyone carved the first stone tool, before language or fire or art, there was something quieter and more mysterious happening. Our ancestors were learning to experiment. They were becoming makers without manuals. No one told them what to do, and there were no teachers or blueprints. They learned by watching the world, by trial and error, by failure and discovery. Every cracked shell and broken branch was part of an ancient classroom. 10 million years ago, survival meant solving small problems over and over again. Food wasn't always easy to reach. Nuts were locked inside hard shells. Roots were buried deep in dry soil. Insects hid beneath bark. But instead of giving up, these early apes began to test ideas. A stone could smash, a stick could dig, and a hand could pry. It didn't look like invention at the time, but it was. Each success was remembered and repeated. Over generations, these repeated actions became traditions. That's what culture is at its core. Not art or music, but shared habits that work. Picture an ancient female sitting by a riverbank. She picks up a branch, strips off the leaves, and uses it to dig for buried roots. Her children watch. The next day, they imitate her movements. They may not know why it works, only that it does. The action spreads from mother to daughter, from one generation to the next, until it becomes part of who they are. That is how the first cultural behaviors were born. Over time, the range of tinkering grew. Stones were chosen not just for shape, but for texture and weight. Some were used to crack open nuts, others to break bones for the marrow inside. Every discovery added another tool to the invisible library of survival. The ones who remembered and shared their techniques were more likely to thrive. It wasn't written down, but it was written into behavior. The brain began to change in response. Problem solving and imitation required memory and attention. These mental skills encouraged planning and creativity. The mind was becoming a workshop long before hands learned to shape flint. The world had become an open laboratory, and every creature that could learn from experience gained an advantage. What made these early makers extraordinary wasn't the tools themselves, but the mindset behind them. They were beginning to understand cause and effect, that actions could shape outcomes. They were learning to predict, to plan, to create order out of chance. Each generation added something new, and those small sparks of insight built the foundation for everything that followed. We often imagine the dawn of humanity beginning with fire or language, but it began here, with curiosity. The courage to test an idea, the patience to try again when it failed, the quiet moment when an ancestor looked at a stone, a stick, or a shell, and saw not just what it was, but what it could become. That was the beginning of us. The earth has never stood still. Even 10 million years ago, long before humans walked upright or built tools, the planet was already moving to a rhythm of endless change. Climate came in cycles, slow and steady at first, then sharp and violent. The air grew cooler, then warmer. The rains returned, then vanished. Forests appeared and disappeared like tides of green across continents. To live in this world was to live inside overlapping circles of chaos. Our ancestors didn't know why these shifts happened, but they learned to feel them. The patterns of nature became their calendar, their teacher, and their test. Imagine a family of early apes living in a fertile valley. Every few years the rains arrive, rivers overflow, and trees bend under the weight of fruit. Life is easy for a time, then the cycle turns. The air dries. The rivers shrink into trickles, and the fruiting trees stop bearing. The group grows restless and hungry. They are forced to move, to find another pocket of green. The young remember where the last refuge was, and they lead the way. Weeks later, when they find a new valley full of food and water, they settle again. They've survived the rhythm once more. But over generations, the rhythm itself begins to change. What once took 10 years now takes 5. The rains fall in new places. Old roots no longer work. This is when intelligence becomes more than a gift. It becomes a necessity. Our ancestors had to learn not only the pattern of nature, but how to adapt when that pattern broke. This dance between predictability and surprise shaped the evolution of memory, planning, and foresight. Those who could remember the past and imagine the future had the best chance to survive. Their brains became archives of cycles. They could recall when certain trees flowered, when waterholes filled, when storms came. But memory alone wasn't enough. The climate of the Miocene was unpredictable on multiple scales. Some shifts came season by season, others spanned centuries. Populations rose and fell with each swing. Entire regions could turn from lush forest to barren dust in a single lifetime. This instability didn't destroy life, it refined it. Every species that endured became sharper, more flexible, more aware. The ability to change became its own kind of stability. The rhythm of the earth became the rhythm of survival. It echoed in migration, reproduction, and cooperation. Even today, the pulse of that ancient pattern lives in us. We sense it in our connection to seasons, in the comfort we take in cycles of day and night, planting and harvest, rise and fall. The ancestors who learned to listen to the planet's heartbeat passed that awareness forward. They didn't just live through the cycles, they learned from them. Every generation became a little better at anticipating the next turn, until one lineage learned to see not just what was happening, but what was coming. That was the beginning of true foresight, the ability to shape the future instead of waiting for it. There were moments in deep time when everything almost ended, long before the great population crashes scientists talk about today. There were smaller, quieter bottlenecks, times when entire groups of our ancestors stood on the edge of vanishing. The fossil record doesn't show the fear, the hunger, or the silence that followed a bad season, but the clues are there in the gaps. Droughts that lasted just a few years too long. Diseases that spread through small populations. A single unlucky event that erased a family line forever. Survival was not a steady climb. It was a constant balancing act on a narrow ledge where one wrong step could mean extinction. Picture a dry season that refuses to end. The lakes shrink to muddy holes. The grass turns brittle and grey. Fruit trees stop flowering. The group grows thinner with each passing moon. Infants cry, but there is no milk. The old fall behind as the young search for water. This is not a distant apocalypse. It's a normal part of life in an unstable world. The difference between surviving and disappearing could come down to a single spring that still trickles under a rock, or a hidden grove that holds the last edible roots. Those who find it live. Those who don't become fossils no one ever sees. Sometimes the threat came not from the sky but from within. Pathogens spread quickly in small populations. A single sickness could sweep through a group of 20 and leave only 2 survivors. Without others to share knowledge or care for the young, those 2 might not last long. The lineage ends quietly, forgotten before it ever had a name. Nature doesn't mourn. It simply moves on. And yet, against all odds, some groups always pulled through. Their survival wasn't luck alone, it was adaptability. They learned to travel farther, to eat what others ignored, to take refuge in harsh environments that predators avoided. These tiny populations carried the genetic spark that would someday lead to us. But each time a drought or disease struck, the numbers dropped so low that recovery seemed impossible. Imagine that happening again and again over millions of years, waves of near extinction followed by fragile renewal every time the survivors were changed. Genetic diversity shrank, but resilience grew. Evolution was sculpting something tough, something stubborn enough to face repeated catastrophe and still keep going. Those early apes were living lessons in endurance. They didn't just survive one crisis. They survived thousands. Each close call made them smarter, more cautious, more cooperative. The narrow ledge of survival forced them to become what no other species had been before, masters of persistence. Every breath we take today is proof that they made it through when they shouldn't have. The line between extinction and survival is razor thin, but it only takes one group, one family, one stubborn individual to keep the story going. And somehow, through drought, hunger, and disease, they always did. The world our ancestors lived in never stopped changing, so their minds couldn't either. 10 million years ago, survival didn't belong to the biggest or the fastest. It belonged to the ones who could switch strategies the quickest. One season might bring fruit, the next nothing but dry roots and insects. Rivers shifted, paths vanished, and entire landscapes transformed within a lifetime. To live through this, early apes had to think differently. They needed memory to recall what once worked, and imagination to guess what might work next. Together, those 2 abilities formed what scientists now call cognitive flexibility. For our ancestors, it was simply survival. Imagine waking up one morning to find your home forest dying. The leaves are gone, the streams are dry, and the animals you once hunted have disappeared. What do? Most creatures would panic or starve, locked into instincts that no longer apply. But our ancestors started to improvise. They remembered the taste of roots dug from the ground during past dry spells. They recognized the flight of birds that always circled over distant water. They tested new foods, even ones that smelled strange or bitter. Each experiment carried risk, but so did doing nothing. Every success, every clever decision became part of a growing mental toolkit. The mind was becoming mosaic, a collection of overlapping strategies for an unpredictable world. Flexibility began to shape every part of their lives. When fruit was gone, they cracked nuts. When rivers shifted, they memorized new paths. When predators appeared in familiar places, They learned to move differently, to travel by night, or stay close to cover. The ability to adapt quickly gave them an advantage over creatures tied to rigid habits. Even their social lives reflected this mental evolution. Communication grew more nuanced as individuals had to coordinate complex plans. Watching others became a form of learning. The young copied what worked and avoided what didn't, building a shared library of experience. That was the first hint of culture spreading through memory and imitation. Imagination also entered the picture. To predict danger or opportunity, our ancestors had to picture things that weren't there yet. The rustle in the grass could mean a predator. A dark cloud might mean rain. Acting on those invisible possibilities was the first spark of creative thought. In time, this ability to simulate the future would lead to problem-solving, planning, and invention. The same mental machinery that once helped apes survive droughts would one day build fire and language. The mosaic mind was the turning point. It taught our lineage to thrive in uncertainty, to see patterns where others saw chaos. Instead of waiting for the world to change back, our ancestors learned to change themselves. That mindset became our inheritance. Every time we adapt to something new, every time we find a creative solution to a problem, we are echoing those ancient survivors who learned that the greatest tool of all was not in their hands, but in their minds. Long before words, our ancestors were already speaking, not with sentences or grammar, but with glances, gestures, and tones that carried meaning deeper than any sound could. 10 million years ago, communication was survival. When danger could strike from any direction, when food had to be found and shared, when trust meant life or death, the ability to send and read signals made all the difference. Every twitch of a hand, every tilt of the head, every change in voice or posture was part of an unspoken language that shaped our evolution long before the first true words ever formed. Picture a group of early apes moving through tall grass. One spots movement in the shadows. Instead of crying out, it freezes, eyes wide, muscles tense. The others see it and mirror the reaction instantly. Without a sound, they all know something is wrong. A subtle flick of the eyes, a slow crouch, and the group begins to back away together. No grammar, no vocabulary, just instinct mixed with shared understanding. That is what communication looked like before speech. A conversation made of body and emotion. Over generations, these signals became more complex. A raised brow might mean curiosity. A soft grunt could mean reassurance. Different tones and rhythms of sound began to carry distinct meanings. High, pitched calls warned of danger in the air. Low rumbles signaled predators on the ground. Mothers used gentle coos to comfort their infants, creating emotional bonds through sound. The ability to interpret these cues required a kind of intelligence that went beyond memory or problem-solving. It demanded empathy, the ability to sense what others were feeling and respond appropriately. That emotional awareness became the foundation for trust. Trust made cooperation possible. Cooperation made survival possible. Communication was not just about sharing information. It was about syncing hearts and minds. When one member found food, they could call others without words. When fear spread, the group could respond as one. Every successful exchange reinforced social bonds and shaped the brain to handle more subtle signals. The face became a stage for emotion. Muscles evolved to express more, and eyes began to reveal intention. Even posture told a story. A relaxed stance showed safety. A forward lean meant aggression or focus. These physical languages were so effective that traces of them still live in us today. We still read tone faster than meaning. We still sense danger in silence. We still comfort each other with touch when words fail. The truth is, humans have never stopped talking without words. Our ancestors simply refined it until sound and gesture fused into language. But at its core, communication has always been about connection, about bridging the gap between minds. In that ancient world of predators and shifting landscapes, every look, every sound, every small motion whispered one simple message between beings that depended on each other to live. I see you. I understand. We survive together. In the ancient world, raising a child was never a solo job. 10 million years ago, life was unpredictable, and every birth carried enormous risk. Drought, predators, disease, and hunger could strike at any time. A single mother, alone with her infant, might not survive a bad season. But something remarkable began to happen within early ape societies. Care became shared. Mothers, aunts, sisters, and even older siblings began helping to raise the young. This wasn't just kindness, it was strategy. Shared care became one of the most powerful survival tools evolution ever produced. Imagine a small group resting under the scattered shade of acacia trees. A mother searches for fruit, leaving her baby with her sister. The infant clings to its aunt's fur, learning her scent, her heartbeat. Nearby, an older juvenile plays with the baby, mimicking adult gestures and learning how to nurture. When danger appears, the whole group reacts. The mother rushes back, but others are already protecting the young, climbing trees, forming a circle, shouting alarm calls. This cooperation turns fragile individuals into a network of safety. Over generations, it changed everything. Species that relied on alloparenting, where non-mothers help raise the young, were able to afford slower childhoods. Babies stayed dependent longer, which allowed their brains to grow larger and more complex. They had time to learn, to observe, to absorb social skills that would serve them for life. Intelligence takes time, and shared care gave evolution that time to work. It also strengthened the bonds between group members. Caring for another's child created empathy and trust that extended beyond family lines. It turned individuals into communities. Mothers could rest, heal, and forage more effectively. Infants received more attention and protection. Older juveniles practiced parenting skills early, preparing them for their own future offspring. Every member benefited, and every act of care rippled through generations. This network of shared responsibility became a social safety net against the randomness of life. When one mother fell ill or died, others could step in. The child survived, and so did the knowledge passed down through it. Learning could now accumulate across seasons instead of being lost with a single death. In a sense, culture was born in the arms of caregivers. The lessons learned from one generation could now stretch into the next, building continuity and wisdom. Even today, traces of this ancient pattern live in us. Human children are still helpless longer than almost any other species. We still rely on extended families, friends, and teachers to help them grow. Every school, every playground, every bedtime story is a modern version of that ancient circle under the trees. The secret to our species' success wasn't just intelligence, it was shared effort. The mothers, aunts, and alloparents, who cooperated long before language existed, built the foundation of human society. They turned survival into connection and ensured that knowledge, love, and care could outlast any single life. Their legacy is us. Survival in deep time was never just about strength or intelligence. Sometimes it came down to luck. The kind of luck that placed a few hundred individuals in the right valley at the right moment when the rest of the world was falling apart. But luck alone was never enough. The ones who made it through were also the ones prepared to use opportunity when it appeared. 10 million years ago, as droughts scorched Africa and forests turned to grassland, a few places remained green. Riparian zones along rivers, mountain slopes that caught extra rainfall, and uplifted forests fed by hidden springs became lifeboats in a dying world. These refuges were small, but they were enough. Inside them, life continued to experiment. Imagine standing at the edge of a dry plain where everything beyond is silent and dead. Yet down in the valley below, a thin ribbon of green winds between cliffs. A stream still flows there, protected by shadow and altitude. Trees hang heavy with leaves. Birds chatter in the branches. It is a pocket of life surrounded by desolation. For the apes who found such places, it was sanctuary, but it also became something more, a testing ground for the future. These refuges forced adaptation to become faster and more creative. Groups that settled near the last surviving water learned how to track its seasonal shifts, how to climb higher when the streams retreated, and how to exploit every food source the shrinking ecosystem offered. Versatility became the key to endurance. Over generations, this constant pressure refined both body and mind. Those who lived in these pockets of stability didn't just survive the changing climate. They evolved within it, learning how to live with fluctuation rather than against it. The geography of luck shaped the destiny of our lineage. Along the edges of rift valleys, tectonic uplift created rain shadows that preserved strips of forest when the surrounding plains dried out. These narrow corridors became living laboratories where small, isolated populations evolved separately, developing new traits that would one day define humanity: larger brains, stronger endurance, and sharper social awareness. The apes in these refuges were the inheritors of both chance and preparation. They had the fortune of location, but the intelligence to use it well. Each generation that endured carried forward a refined version of flexibility, an ability to learn and adapt to microclimates and shifting resources. When the rains eventually returned, those survivors expanded outward, spreading the traits that had kept them alive. The rest of the continent had been reset, but they carried the blueprint for resilience. The story of evolution is often told as progress, but it is really about persistence in the margins. Luck placed our ancestors in the few remaining green corners of a changing planet. Preparedness made sure they didn't waste the opportunity. Together, these forces turned survival into strategy and randomness into evolution. Every one of us alive today carries the proof that somewhere, millions of years ago, luck met readiness, and the spark of our story stayed lit. For millions of years, our ancestors lived on the edge of survival. They weren't rulers of their world. They were its observers, scavengers, and opportunists. The Miocene had taught them to live with instability, to adapt to shifting climates, and to build social bonds strong enough to outlast disaster. They had learned to think ahead, to improvise with whatever nature offered, and to rely on one another when everything else failed. Those habits, born in desperation, would one day turn them from edge dwellers into world shapers. The transition didn't happen overnight. It began quietly, with each generation building on lessons learned by the last. When early hominins emerged from the descendants of those Miocene survivors, they carried that inheritance in their bones and in their minds. They were used to uncertainty, used to movement, used to problem solving. Flexibility was no longer just a reaction. It was a way of life. The old world of endless forests had been replaced by open plains and scattered woodlands. The ones who thrived were those who had learned long ago that no single strategy ever lasts. They became experimenters. They tested new foods, explored new territories, and began to use objects not just as tools, but as extensions of thought. The first chipped stones were not accidents. They were the physical expression of a mind trained for improvisation. Every strike of one rock against another echoed the curiosity of ancestors who had once cracked nuts with sticks and dug for roots in dry soil. The Miocene had already set the stage for this kind of innovation. It taught that survival favored the clever, not the strong. That lesson carried forward into the age of Homo. Cooperation, too, had deep roots. The same social instincts that once kept small bands of apes safe from predators now allowed early humans to share knowledge and plan hunts. The watchful eyes that had scanned the horizon for danger now worked together to track herds and predict migrations. Collective intelligence turned survival into strategy. Communication, born from gestures and tone, became the foundation for more complex coordination. Before words, there were shared glances and rhythms of motion that synchronized groups into living machines of purpose. Fire, when it finally came under control, was not just a discovery. It was the ultimate reward for generations of curiosity and risk. The first human diaspora, the great movement of our ancestors across continents, was built on everything the Miocene had already taught: to travel, to adapt, to learn new landscapes, to depend on each other, and to imagine something beyond the horizon. The apes that once followed the edges of dying rivers had prepared the blueprint for global exploration. Their lessons of flexibility, cooperation, and tinkering became the genetic and behavioral through line that still defines us today. We are the children of creatures who never stopped adjusting, never stopped learning, never stopped trying something new when the old ways failed. The Miocene didn't just shape their world, it shaped the human spirit. When you trace the story of life back through 10 million years, you start to realize something almost unbelievable. We should not be here. Not because of one great disaster or one close call, but because of a million of them. Our existence is not the result of a single escape, but a chain of narrow winds stretched across deep time. Each generation of our ancestors balanced on the knife's edge between life and extinction. And somehow, against every probability, they made it through. Every drought survived, every predator avoided, every disease endured was a small victory stitched into the fabric of what would one day become us. The miracle is not that one species evolved into humans. The miracle is that anything survived long enough for that to happen at all. Imagine the scale of it. The forests that came and went, the rivers that appeared and disappeared, the mountains that rose and crumbled. Through all of it, small bands of apes clung to existence, moving, adapting, inventing new ways to live. Sometimes their numbers must have dropped to mere hundreds, trapped in valleys no bigger than modern cities. A bad season could erase entire populations, yet somewhere, in a hidden pocket of green or a sheltered ridge near a river, a few survived. They passed on their knowledge, their instincts, their stubborn will to keep going. Over time, those fragments of survival built the chain that leads directly to us. The miracle lies in how ordinary those moments were. There were no epic battles, no sudden triumphs, just endurance. A mother keeping her infant alive through a dry season. A group finding a new food source when the old one vanished. A clever individual remembering where the last spring was hidden. These quiet victories were the foundation of everything. Each success was so small it would have gone unnoticed by the world, but together they formed the most improbable story in the history of life. What evolution teaches is that survival is rarely about perfection. It is about persistence. The creatures that last are not the strongest or the smartest, but the ones that refuse to stop adapting. Our ancestors embodied that rule. They survived fire and flood, isolation and starvation, disease and genetic collapse. Every one of those struggles could have ended the line, but it didn't. The odds against them were overwhelming, yet they endured long enough to transform the planet. Every breath we take today is borrowed from their courage. Every heartbeat is proof that they won their battles, one impossible moment at a time. When you step back and look at it all, you can see the truth. The miracle is not that humans conquered the earth. It's that we ever got the chance. 10 million years of close calls, each one a thread in the tapestry of survival, woven so tightly that breaking any strand might have erased us forever. We are, in the simplest sense, the sum of everything that refused to die.